But the Trump administration, which is led by a president who promised and vowed political retribution, is going after multiple people in the opposition party. Nothing normal about it, a line crossed, and the evidence, for the most part, and we'll get into it, cuts against the idea that this would be a valid or normal charge. The New York Times account of the underlying incident puts it simply. The Trump DOJ's case turns on claims that have already been contradicted by video footage and by witnesses who were at the scene. Now, that is a journalistic account. It's from the New York Times. They are not trying to play ball for one side or the other. If you check the Times account of, say, other cases that might involve members of either party, say one of the recent Democratic members of Congress who faced corruption charges and was later convicted, Bob Menendez, you didn't have that kind of really clear rebuttal of the underlying case. And that's important because part of the game here is trying to create mud or confusion in the perspective of what happened so that you don't really know whether this is a political case. And a lot of legal experts, the ACLU today says this is an improper partisan political case. Now, more broadly, we know what Trump campaigned on. A lot of times when you deal with allegations of government abuse of power, the person at the top denies it completely, and then you have to go into their mindset and, with evidence, determine whether there is malicious intent. In this instance, overall, not this specific member of Congress charged, and we'll get into the details, but overall, I would remind you, as a matter of fact, that the current president has already admitted to the goal of abusing power, to target opponents and Democrats, to go after people, to intimidate. So that's a context for the Justice Department's efforts to charge, try, and potentially jail a federal lawmaker who's in the co-equal branch of government that, of course, oversees the DOJ and DHS and ICE. Co-equal. So we're dealing with the line cross in a very big way tonight. And a week ago or a month ago, you wouldn't see reporting that this line was crossed because they hadn't gone after members of Congress this way. Now, the incident happened at that ICE facility. You may recall headlines about it, which matters because the federal officials there, while they're not immune from anything ever they might do, they are in the heart of their federal duties because they have a legal role in overseeing ICE and detention facilities in general. That's why they hold hearings. That's why they sometimes do site visits and tours and subpoenas and gather evidence. And so this ultimately tonight is a troubling case for the separation of powers and the way our government works. The DOJ charging this Congresswoman, LaMonica McIver, for what they claim is an assault on federal agents in that situation at the ICE facility. There was a clash at this Newark facility. The DOJ under Trump is claiming that she did forcibly assault, resist, oppose, impede, intimidate, and interfere with agents, that she was some sort of physical menace against the trained, armed group of ICE agents there. These charges were announced in a very dramatic way by someone who first and foremost rose to prominence as Donald Trump's personal lawyer, Alina Habba. But she announced them because she is now, in that state of New Jersey, the interim U.S. attorney. That's the top federal prosecutor in her district. Journalists identifying that it was a fairly new and inexperienced aide who helped set up these charges and had begun working for Habba just this month. That matters because there are a bunch of career, nonpartisan folks who do this kind of work. So if they had initiated the charge, which is the normal process, that would be less suspicious than having all these political people who are directly tied to the president. As for the Congresswoman, her team says she got the charging document this morning, meaning the effort to get the news out or the online tweets out came first because it was about 12 or so hours after the announcement that she, a member of Congress and now a federal defendant, was actually appraised of her rights and the charges. She's also said, so this is according to her, that there was an offer of some kind of plea deal, and she's rejecting that. The first hearing will be tomorrow morning, as she's explaining.
Representative, can we talk to you about the charges brought against you?
Look, it's political intimidation, and I'm looking forward to my day in court.
Political intimidation. Now, if you want to be more skeptical, you have plenty of cases that involve politics, and you hear a lot about the politicians, whoever they may be, saying it's because they're in politics that they're in any scrutiny at all. But there is other pieces of evidence here. The Washington Post reporting how this is a highly unusual action by DOJ to charge a sitting member of Congress in an incident where no one was injured. Now, that matters again because you look at this and you say, there's a line crossed. This isn't about allegations of corruption or personal conduct or some other activities, which, of course, nobody, because of a political job or any other reason, should be above the law. We've heard that said many times. But this isn't out there in those kind of ways. This is over here in the heart of her duties, in an incident where no one was actually injured, but where the DOJ under Trump now wants to say this was about an assault, a battery, a hurting of other individuals. And so while there can be valid prosecutions of people who happen to be in the opposing party, I mentioned one, Senator Menendez, before, this is beyond suspicious. And it comes amidst a wider effort. So at a certain point, while everyone who cares about fairness and facts doesn't want to assume too much, at a certain point, this isn't the story of one skirmish or one lawmaker. It is the escalating story of how the Trump administration, after Trump promised to do it, appears to be doing what he vowed: political retribution, abusing federal power to go after people with the express intent of scaring them or shutting them up. A lot of experts and other elected officials speaking out along those lines.
This is not typical to charge a member of Congress, and neither is the way the Justice Department rolled it out.
Very rare to file charges against a sitting member of Congress.
This is not about even what happened there. It's about a fight in this country, about due process.
It's complete political theater.
This is a classic example of the administration, the executive branch, weaponizing government.
That's some of the new criticism. Now, as I told you, with that context in mind, we can look at the underlying incident, which DOJ wants to treat under Trump as some kind of deliberate, premeditated assault, and which many other accounts are skeptical of. The Congresswoman was with other lawmakers, both federal and local, visiting the facility. There was a kind of a scrum or a conflict that broke out. ICE agents moved to make an arrest that they have now completely dropped of the local mayor of Newark. And McIver and others are basically seen in what was an unexpected situation, scuffling or surrounding, and you can use any word you want, you can see it for yourself there, in what was clearly an unexpected, chaotic situation, because the federal officials have a role in overseeing the very place that they're at, and now the federal agents seem to be clashing with them. Now, in a back-and-forth clash, reasonable people, reasonable jurors can debate who's pushing who and who's reacting or who's out of control. There's also footage that was posted on social media that shows McIver asking officers basically stop touching us. Again, if this were a congressional hearing, some of the same federal agents would have the duty of keeping security and protecting the members of Congress. Here it became kind of, as you see, a pretty tense grouping of people, and she's talking there. Now, the other mayor, who was also quoted in the montage I just played for you, matters a lot in this, because there was a case, you may have heard about it, you follow the news, that the feds brought, which is a lesser charge, a very, what lawyers call a ticky-tack or kind of silly charge, of the mayor trespassing. Again, that's unusual. It could happen, right, if he ran into someone's home. But usually when you're the mayor and you go to a government facility in public, you know, with your aides in a formal way, you don't usually get a federal trespassing charge. And that's what the DOJ initially tried against Newark Mayor Ras Baraka. That case fell apart. If that was their big opening gambit against a Democrat, it already completely collapsed because the DOJ has dropped those charges. And if you're thinking, wow, there's so much going on, how do you keep track? Well, that's new. If it sounds new, it is new. That was just last night. Flimsy charges, as the New York Times reported. Baraka was actually initially allowed past the fence. That's kind of the opposite of trespassing. Then, quote, invited past the gates before he was arrested, seemingly contradicting the accusations that came more from Trump DOJ that he had, quote, barged into the facility without permission. He was then asked to leave multiple times and exited voluntarily. Top Democrats, experienced and serious people saying the line is crossed, we have a problem. The ACLU, nonpartisan, calling this an autocratic and clearly political type of crackdown. And then if you want to talk about the footage where you say things did look a little out of control and not like the ideal government oversight, That's fair. People can criticize all sorts of ways that politicians in both parties exercise their duties. But legal experts do not see this as a traditional or fair-minded prosecution. And we've seen members of both parties do all kinds of things that sometimes get unwieldy in their political politicking and oversight. Even when those actions were terminated in one case, for example, a Republican riot, the Brooks Brothers riot around election debates, or Republican operatives were basically storming the place. You could call that local trespassing, arguing that ballots should be treated differently. That's on the Republican side. Or you had MTG and Matt Gaetz, who showed up very aggressively at a federal prison where they wanted to make a point about January 6th. Again, you could criticize that, and some people said there were aspects of it that were in poor taste or misleading, but you don't typically have, under administrations in both parties previously, arrests made even for these kind of raucous events. In 2020, Democrats said they wanted to do a kind of a sit-in and kneel in parts of the Capitol. And again, people can like or dislike the image on the screen, but we aren't a country that deals with that kind of political activity by rounding up lawmakers and threatening them with jail time. That's why we're witnessing this major departure. There is a high burden of proof when you deal in these kind of situations. The line is crossed. All of the hypotheticals about what will we do as a country if we get to this point under Trump, we're here now. One of the cases already fell apart. That tells you something about the power of evidence, videos, facts. The mayor's case, gone, but replaced quite quickly, quite suspiciously, to be frank, by a DOJ that seems hell-bent on moving forward on these kind of unusual cases against sitting officials.